remember the moment like it had just happened yesterday, when I told my father where I planned to hold my wedding. The pause on the phone was short, cold. Then his voice came through, flat and sharp. "You're an embarrassment to this family." No hesitation. No questions. Just judgment. I stood in my tiny apartment, the light from the kitchen window spilling across the counter where I had left a stack of bridal magazines and invitation samples. My heart sank, not just because of his words, but because of how unsurprising they were. I had made my choice 2 days earlier, sitting beside Grandpa Arthur in his nursing home room. The walls were pale blue, lined with photos of his old army days and a fading watercolor painting I'd made for him as a kid. He could no longer leave the bed unaided, and his once broad frame had thinned over the years. Still, his eyes remained steady, sharp, even. He asked me about the wedding plans, smiling gently when I told him about the dress. But I could see something shift behind his eyes when he said, "I wish I could be there, sweetheart." That was all it took. On the drive home that night, the decision came quietly and completely. I would bring the wedding to him. Not because I lacked options, I had dozens of Pinterest boards and venues lined up, but because the man who raised me when no one else did deserve to be a part of my beginning. He'd been there for everything else. When my parents forgot my 10th birthday, he baked me a crooked chocolate cake in the shape of a heart and let me stay up past midnight watching war documentaries. When I failed math in high school, he stayed up all night reteaching me equations on a whiteboard he borrowed from the community center. When I didn't get into my first choice college, he told me that dreams didn't die, they just rerouted. He had done more parenting in a decade than my own mother and father had in my entire life. So yes, I chose a nursing home garden over a cathedral. I chose Arthur Reed over prestige. And for that, my family turned on me. When I called to explain, hoping foolishly that love might outweigh appearances, I was met with mockery. My mother stayed silent, only offering an audible sigh before hanging up. My Uncle Doug chuckled. "What are we supposed to wear, hospital gowns?" My cousin Amanda posted a gif of green jello in the family group chat with a caption, "Guess this is dessert, lol." That night, I sat alone in the living room, wedding plans untouched, watching the cursor blink on my RSVP list like a silent accusation. Tears came, not because I was alone but because they made a joke out of my love. They took something sacred and reduced it to punchlines. In the days that followed, I clung to the one person who never made me feel small. Ethan, my fiancé, my constant, held my hand without asking for explanations. When I told him what I wanted to do, he didn't blink. "Then we'll get married at the nursing home," he said simply, as if it were the most natural decision in the world. We went together to visit the staff, planned a ceremony under the lilac trees in the rear garden, where Grandpa liked to sit when the nurses wheeled him out in the evenings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. There would be violin music from a Bluetooth speaker, poles wrapped in soft white curtains to create an aisle, and chairs lined up next to flowerbeds instead of pews. In another life, a parallel one, I could have been walking down marble steps in a ballroom, flanked by smiling relatives and champagne flutes. But in this life, in this version of the story, I would walk toward the only man who had ever truly shown up for me, seated in his wheelchair in his best army uniform, medals pinned proudly to his chest. And yet, in that same timeline, laughter still echoed. Judgment still arrived, dressed in family clothing. They showed up, not out of change of heart, but to witness what they thought would be a spectacle. My father, once proud and immovable, stood in the back row smirking. "A wedding at a hospice center," he sneered. "What's next? Honeymoon in the ICU." Still I kept walking, because this wasn't for them. It never had been. They saw disgrace. I saw devotion. That moment, caught between the blooming lilies and the silent disdain of my bloodline, became the line in the sand, the pivot where past and present collided. I was no longer the girl hoping for approval. I was the woman choosing legacy. And that choice would change everything. The garden was quiet that morning, wrapped in the kind of soft silence that only comes before something sacred. The lilac trees, in full bloom, swayed gently under a shy spring wind. White fabric streamed from the archway we had built from 2 borrowed trellises, and folding chairs were arranged in careful rows between flower beds that smelled of rosemary and marigold. The staff at the nursing home had outdone themselves. A nurse named Rosa had brought handmade bouquets from her sister's flower shop. The maintenance man, Jerry, volunteered to string fairy lights along the hedges, muttering, "Haven't had a reason to hang these since my niece's quinceanera." Even the head nurse, a tough woman named Darlene who rarely smiled, pinned a small corsage to her uniform and offered to walk me down the aisle. Grandpa Arthur was already there, seated in his wheelchair at the head of the aisle. He wore his old army jacket, a pressed white shirt underneath, and a navy blue tie I had given him years ago for Father's Day. He beamed when he saw me in my dress, a simple ivory gown with lace sleeves and a ribbon around the waist. "You look like your grandmother," he whispered, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Only a handful of people filled the seats. Ethan's best friend, a couple of co-workers, the nurses, and 3 elderly residents who didn't fully understand what was going on but clapped anyway, happy for the change of pace. It was intimate, small, imperfect, and perfect because of it. But not one member of my family had RSVP'd. Not one had offered a word since that call. And I had prepared myself for their absence the way one prepares for cold weather, expecting numbness but still stung by it. The ceremony began with Ethan walking down the aisle first, looking nervous but calm, like he always did when facing something meaningful. Then came the music, Vivaldi from the tinny speaker on a nurse's phone, and Darlene squeezed my hand and guided me out. I saw Ethan's eyes first, full of warmth, then Grandpa mouthing, "You're here," like he'd been waiting his whole life for this. But as I stepped closer to the arch, something shifted in the atmosphere. A rustle, a presence, like the sound of a door opening where it shouldn't be. I turned slightly, instinctively, and saw them. My mother standing at the back. Beside her my father, stone-faced but present. Behind them, Uncle Doug, Amanda, even my little cousin with a neon green bow tie. They were awkwardly clustered near the hedges, as though they hadn't meant to arrive so early, or perhaps hadn't meant to arrive at all. A flicker of confusion passed through Ethan's expression, but he didn't move. Pause. The music stuttered, then resumed. Could have stopped, turned around, demanded why. Asked what changed. But I didn't. 'Cause this was my moment, not theirs. So I kept walking. Later, in the reception area, really just a rearranged dining hall with string lights and lemonade, they stood near the punch table like strangers at someone else's party. My mother avoided eye contact. My father made a comment about how quaint it all was. Amanda took selfies with the food. But then something unexpected happened. When the toasts began, Grandpa Arthur was the first to speak. His voice, though raspy, carried weight. "This young woman," he said, pointing a trembling finger at me, "has more courage in her little finger than most men I knew in the war. She chose love. She chose loyalty. And I hope the rest of you were paying attention." A silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. My father shifted. My mother looked down. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumphant. But all I felt was tired. That night, after we cut the cake and the guests trickled out, I found Grandpa asleep in his chair, a smile still on his face. Ethan stood beside me, fingers laced with mine. Outside, the sky was deepening into a velvet blue, and the fairy lights blinked softly like distant stars. And I thought, not of my parents, not of their sudden reappearance or half-hearted presence, but of a moment 10 years earlier, when I had broken my arm falling from a tree and Grandpa had driven me to the hospital with one hand on the wheel and the other on my shoulder, whispering, "I've got you, kid. Always." In the end, that's what the wedding had been about. Not reconciliation. Not spectacle. But presence. And promise. It wasn't until weeks after the wedding that I discovered the truth, though in hindsight the signs had always been there. A glance too sharp, a conversation cut short, my father's sudden interest in Arthur's estate. At the time, I was too caught in the stillness that comes after something hard won. I thought the worst was over. It began with a letter. I found it tucked in the back of Grandpa Arthur's desk drawer while helping the nurses sort through his things. He had been transferred to the hospice wing a few days earlier, and though he remained lucid, his body was failing. I told him I'd take care of the paperwork and the loose ends. He nodded with a kind of trust one didn't feel worthy of and said, "There's a folder you should find. You'll know it when you see it." The letter wasn't addressed to me, but to my mother. Dated 15 years ago. To Margaret. You once asked me why I never forgave you. I didn't have the words then. Maybe I still don't. But know this. There are two kinds of silence, one that protects and one that punishes. I chose the former when I kept the truth from her. But I won't let you decide her future with your bitterness. She's not you. She still knows how to love. I didn't understand what it meant, at least not fully, until I opened the folder labeled Trust and Will, Revised. Arthur had left everything to me. Not just sentimental things, but everything. The small cottage in Vermont, the land near the lake, the savings account I didn't know existed. More importantly, he had designated me as his medical proxy, bypassing both my mother and uncle. The original will, dated 10 years earlier, had my mother as the primary heir. The revision was made 6 months before I moved in to help him. I didn't want it, not like this. That night, I asked him about it, sitting at his bedside while the machines beeped faintly behind us. He was tired, his breathing uneven, but his mind as clear as ever. "I didn't leave it to you out of spite," he said, voice low. "I left it to you because you showed up." I hesitated. But why wasn't I told anything? Why didn't she? Because your mother didn't want you to know who she was before you were born. She wanted to bury her mistakes. I wanted to protect you from the weight of it. But maybe that wasn't fair. Then he told me the story. When my mother was in her 20s, she had eloped with a man Arthur never approved of, a man who later disappeared, leaving her with debt and a newborn, me. Grandpa took us in. He paid off the loans, raised me while she rebuilt herself. But somewhere along the way, resentment replaced gratitude. She blamed him for her failures, for her dependency. And when I was old enough to remember, she started pulling away. From him, from me. "She always feared you'd end up loving me more," Arthur said with a sad smile. Maybe she was right. I didn't know how to hold that truth. It didn't absolve my mother, but it made her wounds visible in a way I hadn't seen before. Flashbacks came in waves after that. Little moments that suddenly carried new weight. The time she refused to let me spend the summer with Grandpa, claiming he was too forgetful. The way she snapped when I said I wanted to study history like him. And the time just months before the wedding, when she told me I was starting to sound just like him. As if it were a curse. The inheritance changed everything on paper but nothing in essence. Grandpa's legacy wasn't the property or the money. It was the quiet mornings we spent reading side by side, the nights he sat beside my childhood bed and hummed old jazz songs, the way he never asked me to be anything but myself. Still, the fallout came fast. When my mother learned of the will, she sent a single message. "So that's what this was all about." I didn't reply. My uncle tried to contest it, said Arthur was manipulated in his old age. But the lawyer shut it down quickly. The paperwork was clear, ironclad. My grandfather had prepared for this. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to the cottage in Vermont. The keys still smelled faintly of cedar. The house was quiet, undisturbed. His old chair was by the fireplace, a stack of yellowed newspapers beside it. I sat there, not to claim what was now mine, but to understand what had once been his. One afternoon, I opened a drawer in the study and found a journal. Inside he had written, "Legacy is not what we leave behind, it's who we leave standing." And somehow, I knew that he didn't mean to leave me anything. He meant to leave me ready. So I stayed in that house for the winter, learning its creaks and quirks. Ethan visited on weekends, sometimes staying longer. We painted the walls. We planted tulips in the front yard. We talked about maybe one day raising children here. And I began to understand the story not just as mine, but as part of a much older one. A story about failure, forgiveness, and the strange, stubborn ways love returns even when we try to bury it. Arthur died in his sleep the following spring. I buried him beside Grandma as he had asked, with a jazz band playing softly in the distance and a small crowd of people who had loved him exactly as he was. And I walked away from the grave not with grief, but with gravity. Carried it all now. And I was ready. The first court summons arrived in an unmarked envelope, weeks after Grandpa Arthur's burial. It was a bland, bureaucratic piece of paper that carried with it the force of a tectonic shift. My uncle Daniel and, surprisingly, my mother had filed a petition to contest the will. The claim: undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud. I sat on the porch of the Vermont cottage with the letter in my hands, the ink almost smudging from my grip. The wind rustled the tulips Ethan and I had planted after the funeral. Everything was finally quiet, peaceful. And then this. I could have laughed if it didn't sting so much. My mother hadn't spoken to me since the day the inheritance was finalized. No call, no message, only that bitter text. So that's what this was all about. But apparently, silence did not mean surrender. It meant strategy. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who had scorned Arthur in his final years were now clawing at his legacy, arguing that his mind wasn't sound when he signed the revised will. That I, his granddaughter, his caregiver, had coerced him for personal gain. In court, the air was cold with formality. The opposing lawyer was slick, precise, and practiced in the art of controlled insinuation. My uncle sat at the table, stone-faced, while my mother avoided my gaze altogether. They brought witnesses: an old family friend who hadn't seen Arthur in years, a nurse who had worked one shift and barely remembered his name. They dug into my financial records, looking for signs of manipulation. They argued that my presence in his final months was strategically timed, that Arthur's judgment had been likely compromised by illness and grief. I sat in the witness stand and tried to breathe through it all. That's when the memories began returning, sharp, vivid. I would often retreat into them during breaks between sessions, as if replaying the truth could somehow shield me from the performance unfolding in court. I remembered the morning Arthur first told me about the will change. We were in the sunroom, light slanting through the windows, and he was sipping tea from his chipped mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Grandpa" text. He looked tired that day but focused. "I need to make some things right," he said quietly. "Your mother, Daniel. They're still waiting for me to make it up to them. But I don't owe them that anymore. What I owe is honesty." "But won't they be furious?" Ted asked. "They already are. I've simply stopped trying to apologize for their disappointments." I remembered helping him sign the documents. How careful he was with his signature. How he asked the notary 3 times to confirm every clause. There was no confusion in him, just resolve. Back in court, Ethan sat behind me every day. He never said much, but his presence was an anchor. At night, we returned to a rented apartment near the courthouse. I often stared at the ceiling in the dark, wondering how long this would go on, how far my own family would go to erase what Arthur had entrusted to me. The worst came when I was cross-examined. My mother's attorney asked, "Did you ever suggest to Mr. Arthur that it would be better if your mother wasn't involved in his care?" "No," I answered firmly. "But you did move in with him, correct? Just months before the will was changed." "I did. And during that time, you helped him with his finances?" "I helped him pay bills and manage basic expenses, yes. At his request." He paused. "So you were, effectively, in control of his daily needs." I knew where it was going. I supported him. He was still capable of making his own decisions. Yet somehow, he changed his will entirely in your favor. Doesn't that strike you as convenient? I looked over at my mother. She still wouldn't look at me. And I realized then, this wasn't about money. Not really. It was about control. About pride. About old wounds that had never been allowed to heal. They wanted to believe I had stolen something because the alternative, that they had lost it on their own, was unbearable. When the verdict finally came, the judge ruled in my favor. The will was upheld. The documents were valid, the intent clear. Arthur had been of sound mind. The revision was lawful. Should have felt like victory. But it didn't. Outside the courthouse, my uncle stormed past me without a word. My mother paused just long enough to whisper, "You think you've won, but you've lost everything." I didn't reply. What could I say to someone who saw truth as betrayal? Back in Vermont, the house welcomed me with the same silence I'd once feared. Ethan poured wine in the kitchen while I lit the fireplace, trying to thaw the cold the trial had left inside me. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. I wasn't sure I was proud of myself, but I was changed. I no longer saw family as something sacred by default. Blood could lie. Love could be conditional. And sometimes the deepest betrayals came not from strangers, but from those who believed they had the right to rewrite your story. But I also understood something Grandpa Arthur had tried to teach me all along. The fight for truth isn't about proving someone wrong, it's about refusing to forget what is right. And in the quiet of that Vermont home, I remembered him as he was. The man who hummed old jazz in the evenings. The man who made tea with honey and told stories that didn't always have endings. The man who left me not just his belongings, but his bravery. The legal war was over. But the real inheritance had only just begun. The first snow of the season came late that year. It blanketed the Vermont hillside slowly, like a hesitant apology, soft and unannounced. I stood at the window of the house Arthur left me, our house now mine and Ethan's, and watched the wind sculpt quiet waves across the porch. The legal battles were behind us, but the silence they left behind wasn't peace. It was something heavier, a kind of emptiness that no victory could fill. It had been nearly a year since Arthur's death, and longer still since I had heard from my mother. I had tried, sent 2 letters, one of which came back unopened, and left a voicemail she never returned. Part of me had given up. Part of me still hoped. It was Ethan who suggested we do something with the inheritance. Something Arthur would have wanted. We sat at the kitchen table, running our fingers along the grain of the old oak wood, talking late into the night. He built things, Ethan said. Furniture, people, places. He restored things. Maybe it's time you do the same. That's how the idea began. We turned the back wing of the house into a community space, a gathering place for elders, especially those forgotten by their families. Arthur had often said that being old wasn't what made people lonely. Being invisible did. I wanted to make a place where people felt seen again. Started small. A weekly book club, a crafts table, weekend dinners. Ethan planted an herb garden for a cooking class. Soon donations came in. Local volunteers joined. Someone called it Arthur's Room, and the name stuck. But building legacy, I learned, isn't just about brick and mortar. It's about healing. And healing doesn't happen in public. It happens in the dark, quiet places we don't often visit. That winter, I found a box in the attic I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked beneath an old army coat and smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Inside were letters. Dozens, written by Arthur but never sent. Most were addressed to my mother. Few to Daniel. And one, folded carefully in a different envelope, was for me. I opened hers first. The handwriting was firm, familiar, and full of longing. Blair, I know I failed you. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to say it in the language you needed. I wanted to make things right in the end, but I see now that waiting until the end is its own kind of cruelty. You deserved better from me long before then. I hope one day you'll understand that my silence was not absence. Cowardice. I held the letter for a long time. I imagined her, younger than me now, feeling forgotten. Maybe even betrayed. Arthur wasn't perfect. But neither was she. Neither was I. I read my letter last. You always saw me clearly, even when I tried to hide. That's a rare gift. Don't let the world dull it. I know what I've left you isn't just money or land. It's a burden of memory, of truth. You may carry it alone at first, but don't carry it with bitterness. The ones who hurt you were once hurting too. Love you. And I'm proud. Don't forget that. Grandpa. I cried not because of what the letter said, but because of what it gave me permission to do. Forgive. It didn't happen overnight. But that spring, I drove down to my mother's neighborhood. Her house looked the same. Quiet, pristine, distant. I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes before I finally walked up the path. She opened the door slowly, guarded. Her eyes flicked to my face, unsure. I held out the letter. "I found something," I said. "It's his. I think you should have it." She stared at it for a moment, then took it with shaking hands. There were no tears, no sudden reconciliation. Just silence. But this silence felt different. Not the absence of love, but the space where it might grow back. "I didn't know," she whispered, eyes not leaving the page. "I didn't either," I said. "But I'd like to." She nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't say anything else. But when I walked back to the car, I felt something begin to lift. Months passed. Arthur's room expanded. A local paper wrote a piece about it, calling it a place where memory becomes presence. I kept that phrase taped above the kitchen sink. Daniel never reached out. And maybe he never will. But I no longer felt the need to chase apologies. Some things are left behind not in anger, but in peace. Ethan and I hosted a small gathering on the first anniversary of the center. It was late summer. Warm. Sunlit. As guests arrived, I caught sight of my mother at the back gate. She didn't bring flowers or gifts. She brought a tray of shortbread cookies, the kind Arthur used to bake on Sundays. I smiled and she smiled back. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives like snowfall. Quiet. Reluctant. But inevitable. And so the legacy grew. Not just in bricks or community dinners, but in every softened edge, every handwritten letter passed between generations, every act of seeing someone fully. Arthur had built things. I had rebuilt something of him. And, perhaps, of myself. Not all stories end in perfect repair. But the ones that matter end in motion, in trying. And I was still trying. Still building. Still loving.